people who listen to the podcast, they might not be aware that you've also got a newsletter and a blog. And I bring this up because the other day in my inbox, your recent email or newsletter came up and it was really interesting. It was titled The New Normal. Do you want to just give the listeners who didn't have the privilege of seeing that newsletter a little bit of a rundown of what was in it?
Sure. You know, people who go to my website, catherineschweit.com, can sign up for my newsletter. And then I try to kind of write about whatever's going on and what's new. And so I said the same day Japan's former Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, was assassinated with a homemade gun, July 8th, I checked to see how many violent firearms deaths we had so far this year in the United States. The number was somewhat north of 10,000.
Wow.
We also generally clock twice as many suicides and accidental deaths by firearms. Reports are that Japan has had about a dozen gun-related criminal cases in the past year, resulting in 1 death and 4 injuries, most of the cases involving gangs. A few days after Mr. Abe was killed with a homemade gun, 15 people died when a group of men drove up and opened fire in front of a local tavern in Johannesburg's Soweto township in South Africa. This occurred just days after the July 4th shoppers at a Copenhagen, Denmark mall scattered after a 22-year-old with a rifle sprayed bullets, killing 3 and injuring more than a dozen. 3 overseas events make it into the international news every time because they are rare and horrible. Because they are not normal, they garner news coverage. The United States is not Japan or Copenhagen. I reflected on the estimated 19 million guns sold in the United States last year and matched this with more than 200 deaths that occurred over the July 4th weekend alone. It is hard to acknowledge that gun violence happens across the globe, but in the United States, we might make more headway on fighting gun violence if it was accepted that violence and self-inflicted gun deaths are now our new normal.
What a shitty new normal.
Yeah, I know. That's my job, though. I mean, I don't know why I say it's my job because I don't even have a job anymore. But
she says from her retirement.
Right. But I feel like it's my job to say what to me is the obvious. Yeah. And, you know, I was having a conversation yesterday. Some of our listeners might know who Newt Gingrich is. Newt Gingrich was the Republican Speaker of the House for a long time, and very much a power broker in the US for years and years. And I was asked to be on his podcast. So I was talking to him the other day, and the first thing that he asked me about was, we had an incident that occurred in Indianapolis where there was a shooting in a mall, Indianapolis, Indiana, and there was a shooting in a mall by an individual who came to the mall intending to kill a lot of people. Stepped into a bathroom, came out of that bathroom an hour later and began firing at people in a food court. And there was a 22-year-old nearby with his, I'm going to say girlfriend, but it could have been his wife, and I apologize for not recalling which. And he was carrying a handgun, which he owned and he had a legal right to carry. And he drew that gun and fired and killed the shooter from a pretty good distance, particularly for somebody who has no law enforcement experience and military experience. And that was viewed as a citizen-involved shooting that is really pretty unusual. And Mr. Gingrich was asking me about that. And as we began to talk, I said, you know, but we have to remember that those kinds of civilian responses in, say, 400 kind of active shooter situations we've had in the last 25 years, we've had maybe a dozen where a civilian successfully pulled a gun and neutralized or even interfered with a shooting.
Right.
Yeah. So it's very unusual to have that happen. But once we started talking about shootings, and I, just as an example, I told Mr. Gingrich that 2/3 of our firearms deaths in the United States are suicides. He was kind of shocked, and it stopped him in his tracks. And he said, I don't think we talk about firearms this way. And so I guess that's what I try to do in my newsletter.
I come to you as my news source, which is a little bit lazy. But this whole idea that a civilian has shot and stopped a killer, what is that going to do for the rhetoric around guns and gun access in the US? Is it going to be a positive thing or a negative thing, in your opinion?
I think it's going to embolden people to think they can stop a shooter, and it's going to prompt more people to carry their guns with them all the time. And whether that's a good or bad thing, I think time will tell.
Yeah.
Because it's very unusual. And we have, a number of people who've been killed when they have tried to confront a shooter with a weapon, because they're not as accurate as they think they might be, because, the last time they shot was 6 months ago at paper in a gun range, and they never raised a gun to an individual. And we may see some shooters who, in their panic to fire their weapon, hit other innocent civilians.
Right,
I
exactly.
worry about that, and time will tell. And, it's easy to talk about all the dire circumstances that can happen, but I would think that we will definitely have more people who are saying, I'm never going to the mall again without my gun. I'm never going shopping again without my gun. I'm never going to the movies without my gun. So we're going to have a lot more guns out probably on the street. One of the things that I talked about in my newsletter is that people in the media, the decision makers on what coverage there is, people are making decisions on what goes on the news feed. Part of what prompted me to write this newsletter is that there were interviews done with news leaders in the United States on how they make decisions. And one of the things that I think was truthful on their part and horrifying is one of the producers who was interviewed by the news reporter said, we make a decision based on how horrific the shooting is and how many people are killed.
Wow.
And doesn't that just encourage the next person to do a better job of killing more people?
Yeah. If you're wanting that contagion effect to just take off, make the people famous that are giving you the biggest numbers and the most horrific incidents.
So I just kind of wanted to put that out there and pose this question. What is it that is going to make you comfortable? What do you want to know? What do you think we can do to stop the killing? I'd be happy to hear those things. Not that I can respond to all of them, but I'd be really happy to hear those things, Sarah, and I would be happy to talk about those situations. And then I guess I would challenge you to not pander to the news of the horrible. I read a news story just the other day that said that a massive amount of people don't watch the news because it's too depressing. Take small bites of it, but understand the news or you won't be able to affect change. Also, don't pass on stories, photos, videos. Don't let your horror make you be part of the news, and don't only read and click on the news stories that have to do with horror, right? I mean, true crime is something that fascinates all of us. And I think it's a healthy fascination, because the idea of why does somebody choose to do this is fascinating. But pandering to the horrible isn't necessarily a good thing if it continues to foment more violence. That's what I'm concerned about. Maybe that's a little too esoteric for this hour of the day.
I think it's a question that comes up a lot around true crime. It was interesting at CrimeCon in London, they had a panel talking about that very thing. And there was a psychologist on it. And I thought it was really interesting what she said, because you look around the audience and it's mainly made up of females that are in the true crime listening audience that were at CrimeCon in particular. And the question was, why is so many women interested in true crime? And it was more about that a lot of these crimes are against women, not necessarily mass shooting, because it's such a, what's the word?
It's an everyman sport.
God, well, that is can I just say, a fucking horrific bumper sticker.
Mass shooting, everyman sport.
Yeah, you've hit that on the head.
There's a misogynistic aspect to so many of these incidents. Violence against a woman.
And I think that now there is enough true crime content out there that you don't have to put into what somebody termed trauma porn in your earbuds.
Right. I agree.
There's no need for that. Find information that is victim-led and empowering and gives you some tools when you've come out of listening to it.
I like that. I mean, definitely that's a great message, and a great message to end on, because there are so many positive things that can come out of a negative if you look for them. The negatives are going to happen. Let's find the positives.